Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I am hoping that I'm not going to take the full 30 minutes, try to kind of move quickly through the slides. But I wanted to today have a sort of a discussion, I guess, or rather show you some of the work that we've done that I think speak to this notion of scarcity, especially when it comes to running a global practice where you have to encounter different realities, different sort of modes of availability of technologies, and what it's been like to really sort of go through that and sort of trying to find the right strategies, I guess, as we're going along. I think when we are trained as architects or even as engineers, as many of you are here, there's just sort of a lot of examples that we have or that we internalize, to some extent in terms of the kind of work that we want to do and the sort of possibilities there are and those very cool, developments that can happen. How can you make, for architects, just kind of have this freedom of making all kinds of forms and shapes and not be beholden to certain, sometimes you almost don't want to even be beholden to gravity, to some extent, where we really are looking for this freedom of realization. And also as engineers, I imagine, because I'm not an engineer, but I imagine there's also something incredibly exciting about really finding, the limits, stretching the limits of materiality, stretching the limits of, what you can do in terms of form, in terms of if I'm thinking about some of the structural engineers we work with, for example, this is something that comes up a lot. But I think one of the, this is actually the wrong image, but one of the things that really came to the surface for me was that being educated in sort of more of a Western setting also meant having a certain unique view or one-dimensional view of what materials we have available to us or what kinds of techniques we're supposed to use. But also, most importantly, this idea that any sort of new progress or ideas can only be born out of one context, which is the Western context, I guess, to some extent, and that in a way, there's sort of this constant search for new technologies or ways in which to improve others, often also sort of this idea that we develop solutions for others, we save them, to some extent. Those were all things that I was very much sort of swimming in, I guess, as I was going through my education, but I was very much also taken aback by, because there was something strange with the notion that there's sort of one part of the world that has the answer to everything, regardless of the fact that the entire planet has been engineering, mathematicking, architecturing its environment since the dawn of time. So I came to sort of this point of uncertainty, but also of questioning. Growing up, as was said earlier, I grew up in Niger, and growing up also in the middle of the Sahara Desert. So I grew up near the city of Agadez, where I could definitely see architecture that was hundreds of years old, that has some striking qualities, in terms of architectural expression, but also even what was possible in terms of how high you could go, because again, we had accepted this idea that, certain kinds of volumes and heights, and all of that were only possible in certain contexts and with certain materials. And that was just something, as I was going through my architectural studies, that I was just thinking that clearly that wasn't true. And that there was sort of this also interrogation around what is it that we're doing when we are making materials or taking materials from certain contexts that are developed, that are very, and when I say developed, I just mean that they have been allowed to have a certain sort of lifespan of a certain evolution, that takes them further and further along in sort of what is possible, versus in places like these where essentially the building technology has been frozen in time for the simple reason that we have now a new mode of operating in the world, right? That is global, that is globalized. And that has basically erased or taken out these kinds of techniques and these kinds of approaches from the continuum of history, but also from the continuum of technological evolution to some extent. So it just kind of reinforces the idea that there's nothing that you can do with these kinds of techniques, and that everything new you make has to be erased to some extent. And so today, I wanted to specifically talk about, it's really the story of this one village, where we developed some of our first projects. And it was sort of this setting, as you can see here, where it's very remote, it's pretty much desert. The village was really sort of struggling, trying to deal with a demographic explosion, but at the same time, lack of resources. And so I just kind of approached it with this idea that, again, this is a place of scarcity, right? This is a place where you don't really have much, there isn't really much rain, you don't have access to many materials, you don't have wood, you don't have, there's just so many different things, definitely no steel, no concrete, or anything like that. But then when you're trained, in all of these different things, what do you do, right, at the end of the day? But then at the same time, to see that it was a place where you would just encounter these really striking structures, this kind of incredibly beautiful, very, very simply made, but resistant, and kind of things that have a certain longevity because there's sort of an inborn and ingrained technique that is perpetuated, that is maintained, where you can keep these kinds of architecture alive. And that was incredibly intriguing to me, and it made me realize that this is something that I knew nothing about, and that perhaps that there was something there, some answers, in how to approach these kinds of places where, a shell doesn't have to come with a whole sort of armature, that you grid, that you design, and then you clad, that actually these are molded by hand, almost like you mold sort of a vase, but to this kind of scale. And so we had this opportunity to work on a market project in this village. This is a place where markets are weekly, basically, and people come from different villages, and to propose their wares. And so the market tends to be more or less temporary. There's kind of a structure that stays there, but it's mostly empty. And one of the ambitions of the village was to actually have a weekly market in order to really develop true economy for that market and to give more opportunities for the people of the village. And so what they had was just, the simple adobe, post and, these thatch roofs that were very effective actually in ventilation when they were underneath it. The bricks were made quite, classically the way they've been made for thousands of years in this particular region. And then it just had kind of this, what I found just incredibly beautiful, simple, rational, system of just these little cubes of spaces, with this thatch roof. That was incredibly comfortable, actually, when you went inside. It was just so much cooler because of the thermal sort of properties of the bricks. That would allow that. And there was something very valuable that I found in this expression, and that I thought was a good opportunity to, rather than trying to come up with something new, to actually lean in and find a way of developing. And so kind of thinking about how to makes almost a new interpretation of something that already exists, rather than this idea that something has to be forever new, forever, something like you've never seen before. I was trying to figure out how do I actually make something that they've always seen, but that still feels new to some extent, that still uses some form of technology, that still uses science, that still uses all of these different things, but also is incredibly familiar through this system of, post and, brick walls, and all of that. And so we had been already working with compressed earth bricks, which are stabilized bricks, using local soil that you have, that we just dug up from maybe 5 kilometers, no more than 5 kilometers away, on the site, and then we just add 5% of cement in them, using these presses to make these very simple bricks, right? But the nice thing about these bricks is that they don't require the same amount of maintenance that Adobe does in terms of yearly maintenance. But also they are a lot more resistant, and they have the same thermal capacities that Adobe bricks have. So you don't sacrifice anything in terms of thermal quality. And I should say that the reason why I keep talking about the thermal quality is because this is also a part, as you saw, it's almost a desert, it's 40 to 45 degrees, temperature year-round. So then all of a sudden, when you're talking about certain kinds of materials or technologies, it start mattering a lot. And it was sort of this introspection about what we're being taught versus what is logical to do for a certain place, how we can be taught to lean into the freedom that we have from concrete and steel, and all of those things, but then actually, depending on what you have to deal with, in terms of lack of electricity, concrete being the kind of material that is so conductive and that imprisons heat, all of a sudden, then it doesn't make sense to do anymore. Hence the exploration for these kinds of materials instead. But also to start thinking about how to, really get to the bottom of very simple approaches and strategies related to ventilation. That's just like basic physics rules. Hot air rises to the top, cooler air is at the bottom. So it was really about just kind of figuring out, okay, well, how do you engineer that, quote unquote, in a very rudimentary, very simplistic, anybody can build this type of way. So this is a place where, because we don't have wood, for instance, we use a lot of metal. We recycle a lot of metal. And so then metal attracts a lot of heat. So then it became this whole game of trying to figure out how do we create shade, because again, we cannot plant trees that can grow fast enough to provide shade for this particular place. It would take 25 years. So then using the metal to make shading systems, but the kind of shading systems that rather than actually increasing heat on top of people's heads, we figure out the appropriate height, at which to place them, to collect a huge amount of heat and then help precipitate the hot air from the bottom to go towards the top, but then also create these different levels of the shading system in such a way that it creates ventilation and it creates air movement. So this, again, is just using not so much technology, but science, I guess, scientific sort of laws to just make very simple things that anybody can make to some extent. And so, because one of the things that I've always been wary of is sort of this idea that, as I was saying in the beginning, that we can be here in our comfortable settings, creating all these really cool, engineered solutions that we think would be great for, such and such place. It's like, wouldn't it be great if this could be for refugee settlements, or this could be for, all of these different things, which I find incredibly troubling as an approach, because there's also inherent in that a certain superiority complex that says that, of course, we have all of the answers, and our answers are the only true answers. But there's also this perpetuation of not only infantilizing the other, othering the other, infantilizing them, and also keeping them in a state of dependence to some extent, because you put in place things that cannot be perpetuated unless you go around and retrain everybody. And that's also something that we love to do, because the problem is not with the things that we put in place. The problem is that people are not educated enough. And so then we seek to educate them to know how to do it. And so what I found much more interesting in this setting was, how do we go about seeing the skills that are already present on the ground, but taking them and elevating them to some extent, and allowing or kind of producing new things, but that are really based on the local skills and the local know-how. And so it kind of started becoming this project that evolved from this point of view to, in the end, produce this market, where at the end of the day, it also became, it was very funny, because as it was being built and as these discs started popping up and getting painted, it became sort of this weird social media phenomenon in the country, where people would just come and take pictures of it and post it on Facebook. But I think for the simple reason that there was this feeling that was echoed when I first showed the renderings of what we were thinking about for this project. And the question was, this is going to be for here. And I was completely taken aback by that answer, by that question, because it kind of hinted again at this problem of, number one, we never get to have things that are just properly done and that are just, just well executed and that have a certain sort of modern feel to them. And number two, in a way, they felt that this was also very familiar. When the village opened up, when the market opened up, there was an immediate appropriation of the spaces where nothing had to be explained to anyone in order, to figure out how to use it or how the different spaces function or anything like that, because it was just based on something that already existed. It just had a completely different sort of incarnation and I guess a little bit of pizzazz compared to what was there before. But from my point of view, it was pretty much the same thing that we remade. And so it was fascinating for me, this was on opening day of the market, to see how they sort of reappropriated all these different structures in ways that I actually never even imagined, the ways that they found interesting manners of displaying all of the different wares that they were selling, the way it became very resourceful. They became very resourceful because in the beginning we had been asked to produce 10 boutiques, quote unquote, 30 boutiques for this space for a certain budget. But the idea was that this was supposed to be a permanent place. We were definitely asked to make it out of concrete, which we refused. And we were able to get away with that because instead we proposed 52 different stalls, but for below the budget that they already had. And the reason why that's possible, it's again because of this use of more of a local material, used of this recycled metal that everybody knows how to do very well, which also meant that we had huge savings in terms of labor also, because it was really local labor. There were some people from the village also who came and helped with the construction, and all of that. We didn't have to import anything. We didn't have to bring in special expertise from the capital, or something like that to do it. It was really regional effort to make it happen. And so then this is just kind of more of the same. But before we worked on this project in this particular village, we worked on another one, which actually led us to Land the Market project. And I guess maybe that's the central discussion here today. This building is a mosque. That was sort of the main central mosque of the village, and as you can see, it was essentially running down. It's made out of adobe. It had been there for some time. But one thing that the decision, I guess, taken by the village elders was that this should be knocked down because it was also too small for the population that was really growing. For example, there was no more space for women to pray because the men had taken all the space. And but the maintenance of this was becoming something of a burden because a lot of the knowledge around the maintenance of adobe is quickly disappearing because nobody wants to work with that material anymore. So there's sort of this notion to knock it down, but build a replica of it twice as big in concrete, because concrete allows you to do that, right? So again, it's kind of this idea of this material and this idea of projecting modernity through a certain material. And there was sort of this need, locally to do it through this material because that's what we've been taught. We've been taught that unless you make something out of concrete, glass, steel, all of those things, it's not modern, it's not contemporary, and somehow there's something, backward, about it that you need to fight. Meanwhile, when we did some research, we found out that this mosque actually was built by a master mason who won an Aga Khan Prize for Architecture in 1986 for the same mosque, just a bit larger, that he did in his village. And then we went through and found two other mosques, identical. And apparently it was a collection of 4 mosques that he did for this particular region. And they were essentially a marvel in sort of traditional building techniques, and mechanism. Like it was just, going inside of it was just so incredible to see these different techniques, these ways that, these techniques I actually had encountered when I was a student, saw them in a couple of books for northern Nigerian architecture, which is very similar to what we have in Niger, how you can make these pans and these vaults and these incredibly intricate and ornate columns, but they're all made out of mud. And it's basically this reinforced mud technique where essentially you have wood instead of steel, and you pack the wood. So it's kind of the same technique as concrete to some extent, but without formwork. And they just managed to make these amazing kinds of architecture with it. And this mosque was really made with that kind of technique. And so we decided to fight to keep that mosque alive, essentially, and to say that, again, they had a budget, which I thought was oversized. And so we made the proposition of saying that if we're able to save the mosque, build a new mosque, still come within or below budget, would you allow us to do that? And that's essentially how we ended up getting the project. And so we were able to find the masons who created the original mosque because they were just 1 hour away. So we invited them back to help sort of start rehabilitating this mosque, bringing back, they knew exactly all the details that had been washed away by the rain. They remembered from memory how to recreate them. They reoriented the facade, you know, and all of that. And we just kind of decided to, I will not bore you with the details because we don't have time, but essentially we turned that old mosque into a library. I will spare you the details of how that came to be because it was an incredibly complicated, very fraught process because we had to go through issues of, well, how do you, it's blasphemy to turn a mosque into a secular space. So we had to have all of these different discussions around religion, around what actually the religion says versus what our interpretation is, et cetera, et cetera. But in the end, we all came to an agreement. It became a library. It was sort of, you know, repacked and redone and brought back to life in this way. But then we still had to deal with this notion that, well, the material is different. It is difficult. It's still mud. How do you step away from the need for maintenance on a yearly basis? So we were able to find these other masons in another town, which is closer to where I grew up, the town of Agadez, who had this knowledge for how to mix mud with very simple natural elements like Arabic gum for the interior and salt, because the salt actually makes the building resistant to termites, which is a massive problem. So a lot of the wood was being eroded by termites, so they had to remove a lot of these different beams had to basically be excavated. The wood had to be replaced because it had been eaten up by the termites, and the salt was going to keep the termites at bay. And the Arabic gum turned the mud into this fluid, almost paint-like substance, but that was also waterproof, and that gave it a certain sort of plasticity and hardness that made it last longer. And then on the outside, they told us that we could just mix the mud, for example, with shea butter. So we started like boiling this massive vats of shea butter to mix the mud with, because again, it hardens the mud, makes it waterproof, and now makes it that we only need to maintain it every 8 years rather than every year, for example. So at the same time, we still had to make the new mosque, right? And we just kind of decided to use the same bricks that I showed earlier to kind of start making the structure across from the original mosque, which would be a hybrid system, because we were really very much interested, not so much on being dogmatic and saying that, oh, you can never use any concrete, you know, or anything like that. That's not the point. The point, again, is to kind of make the rational decisions about what matters and what doesn't. So when we started getting to a certain height, without any kind of floors in between, it became very difficult to do that as low-bearing brick. Also, it became much more expensive. So it was also figuring out what makes sense from an economic point of view, what makes sense from a climatic point of view. So we were still able to use the bricks to have the thermal mass to make the interiors comfortable and build it in this way. And along the way, we encountered this weird, little funny problem where we designed the mosque to have all these collection of domes as the ceiling and as the roof of it in the same way that the previous mosque had. But we wanted to do kind of a new interpretation of that. And so the contractor we had, which was the fancy, kind of like educated contractor, made these formwork, out of metal or out of wood and tried to make these domes out of it. And it was an abject failure. We essentially came and found these weirdly misshapen domes. It was very difficult because they didn't have all of the technology that you would need to make a perfect dome with formwork. So again, the problem of transferring technology, but with that sort of local understanding versus using local understanding to make new technologies. And so in the end, the same masons who were helping us with the shea butter, and all of that in the old mosque, came and basically found, the picture on the left. I was literally sitting on the ground thinking this project is doomed, it's over. We're never going to be able to make these domes properly. This is going to be, we're going to have to kind of scrap all of this. And they just came and just said, well, what's the problem? Maybe we can help you with this. And I just asked them, well, do you know how to make these domes? And they were like, yeah, of course. And I thought, but how? Like, how do you make them? And he got so irritated with me. And he just looked at me and was like, do you want me to do it or what? I said, I'm sorry, can we try one of them to test and see? And he said to me, we can do 3 at a time. If you want, we can just make a quick prototype for you to see. And so they just basically got on top of these curved beams and started laying out bricks 1 at a time by hand. Absolutely 0 instruments. It was done 100% by hand, with nothing to be added. And they produced these absolutely perfect half spheres that, in the end, we even had a massive one that was 8 meters in span. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, how do you do that? And they were like, no, don't worry. We know the technique. This is what you do. And then because also they knew how to work with concrete a little bit, and they were like, oh, we'll just have this intermediary beam, like halfway through the dome, and then we'll add to it. I was like, it'll be fine. I thought, okay, sure. And so in the end, they just made these perfectly beautiful, domes with these kind of intermediary domes to plug the holes, in between. And it produced basically this ceiling, right, inside. And that was basically what ended up being the ceiling, and the roof of this building. And as I was saying, so also, I just want to point out real quick that I completely failed at my attempt at doing this fast because I only have 3 minutes left, but I'm going to try to hurry up. Then I was telling you about how, this is a place where we use a lot of metal. And actually metal, in West Africa specifically, metal work is something that is over 1,500 years old in terms of technique. So there's sort of this really deep understanding on how to deal with metal. And actually, blacksmiths were considered to have even sort of like these supernatural powers. Like a few centuries ago, it was sort of this whole thing. And so, we have today's, blacksmiths that we work with a lot. And it was fascinating to me to see, again, how with just very, very simple tools, they essentially just have, just a couple of things, but they can make anything you can think of. So they're the ones who made the discs that I showed earlier, for the market. But then, we kind of, they helped us make all the different openings, the windows, the doors, and all that for the mosque, using these very simple techniques that you showed earlier. And in the end, we were able to make it look like this. But again, extremely fast also, because there was also this idea that unless you're using technology, kind of like very kind of advanced processes, it's not efficient time-wise. I was completely floored by actually how fast, and that it was incredibly comparable because the techniques to produce it was so much simpler, was so basic, that there was no time issue in terms of what you had to sacrifice, which you didn't really have to. So in the end, this ended up becoming, rather than one mosque being destroyed and another one being used, being destroyed and a larger one being built in its place, ended up becoming a complex with, a library, workshop spaces, a new mosque, this whole space in between them, basically a civic space for the entire village that now has become the sort of rallying point for all the different villages all around it. And in the end, it was not at all what we set out to do, but we were able to make that happen with, again, below sort of the cost of what they were planning on doing by creating this concrete bunker, essentially, that it was going to be. I think what I like through the story of these 2 projects that live inside of this same village is the transformative sort of capacity of really looking at what the opportunities are in a certain place and seeing how we further those, rather than always just being in our little silo thinking how to make something better for someone else, but without kind of keeping into account that they might know things that we don't. For these projects, to me, as an architect, I made a bunch of drawings. but really, they build these projects. And this is not a plea for some kind of, self-building and people have to build their own. No, these are experts. They're experts, just like I'm an expert in architecture, and they essentially were able to make this project for, based on the skills that they have, and now went on to do so many more projects after that, and actually got hired by all kinds of different organizations to do, projects throughout the country, because now they have this certain skill and a certain confidence, because the skill was always there. I think the game changer with the projects was the stretching of those skills, to apply it to things that maybe they've never done before, to scales they've never done before, but then also for us to start thinking about how do we, from project to project, keep stretching these same skills and come up with new things, but within this framework. And I like to think that there is space, in our practices for that kind of approach and mindset, so that we can come out of our box a little bit and able to really engage with things as they are and further that rather than superimposing. So that's what I wanted to share today. Thank you.